Before we begin, please be advised that this show may contain some adult themes that may not be appropriate for all listeners. Use your discretion. Now, on to our show. Welcome to the Sip Saga Society, where we cover histories, mysteries, and just any story worth telling. Every week, Karina, Randi, and occasionally Greg cover a year in time while slowly traumatizing each other along the way. My name is Karina, and I am one of your hosts, and this is part 2 of our episode on 1767. In part 1 of year 1767, Karina covers the history of El Colegio de Loyola San Ignacio Vizcanes, a historic school in the center of Mexico City, Mexico. Part 1 is already out and available on anywhere you found this podcast. On to our show.
Okay, Greg, hit us with your next fact.
Okay. I also just want to say I looked at pictures of the college. It's beautiful. I can see why people have weddings there and stuff because it looks amazing.
And it's huge.
Yeah.
A whole block. I could not get over that part. Like, we'll take all of it.
You know what I'm
But
picturing? I'm picturing the high school from 10 Things I Hate About You. It's like that level. You know what I mean? That level of a school being something else. I haven't looked at pictures yet, so I have no idea if I'm right or wrong.
I don't know. I don't. It's in the middle of the city, so it's not like a whole lot of space. I think it's more courtyards than like yard.
Mm. Okay.
Mm-hmm. It's very
okay.
beautiful. Okay,
You want
go.
the facts?
Yes. Now on to
Okay.
part 2.
So my pronunciation for some of these things might be a little off, but in November of 1767, Aconostota and Attacullaculla, two of the chiefs of the Cherokee people, departed from Charleston, South Carolina, on a ship to New York City, where they're basically making their way to talks with the British guy who was the superintendent of Indian Affairs. That was his title. His name was Sir William Johnson. And this was like kind of like the beginnings of this larger conference that they had that eventually hammered out the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768. That was like this was like an effort after the proclamation line was passed to try to be like, okay, this didn't work. Now let's set a line over here, further over, and get indigenous people to give up this land. Because, like, we obviously blew past this first line. So, like,
Yeah.
maybe if we set it here at the Ohio River, it'll be okay. And, like,
Wait, Greg, would
yeah,
you just mind? So this is actually pertinent for my story tonight. Would you
okay.
mind explaining exactly what the proclamation line is for our listeners?
Yeah, so at the end of the Seven Years' War, or like in the United States, you often hear it called the French and Indian War. During the Treaty of Paris in 1763, as a result of that, the British got like all of France's territories in the northern part of the hemisphere. So like not like in the South, but everything above the New England colonies. So like modern day Canada and like as far as they considered the French territories to go. Now, obviously, indigenous people are not consulted in any of this, and so this is Europeans in Europe drawing up these agreements and then, saying, okay, we own all this territory. So the British like to try to get settlers to stop causing conflicts by moving on to indigenous land passed the proclamation line that same year, which essentially was like the Appalachian Mountains were kind of like the dividing line between British territory and indigenous territory. And this is, well intended on a certain level because the British realize that this is a problem and they don't want more wars with indigenous people because they just spent a shitload of money, like millions and millions of pounds, which would be like, I don't know what that converts to in today's dollars, but a lot of money on this war with France. And they're like, we are broke. And that's what kind of starts the whole, like, let's tax the colonies kind of thing. Um, so that's the proclamation line. It's basically they were like officially like no colonist is to pass this line. Everything else on the other side is indigenous land. But
Hmm.
this gets like just absolutely run over. And so within, 5 years or so, they're already trying to negotiate a new treaty, which nobody's going to walk away from super happy with at the end of it. Like Stanwix is kind of a mess. And so, like, land is given up, but like no one really enjoys the terms. So, but I thought it was interesting that, again, it's one of those things where like we wish we could capture people's experiences or like get some insight into that. This, like, these two chiefs of emissaries of the Cherokee people are being sent, and they're like, this may have been the first time they've been on like an English style ship, and they've gone from South Carolina to New York, and then they're going on this big diplomatic journey. It would be really interesting to, know if like any record of their like journey or thoughts or anything like that survives. I don't know personally, but it's kind of like a starting point where I'm like I kind of want to dig into that.
Oh, that would be interesting. I
Yeah.
did just Google it, Greg. It would cost Britain today about 10 to 15 billion
Hmm.
uh pounds, which is over 15 billion USD. That's what the war with France cost Britain.
I believe it. I mean, it was huge, I mean, to the point where like
Dang.
Britain's like, how are we going to pay for all of this?
Hmm.
Um,
And that proclamation line is a really big fucking deal.
it
Like
is.
it's like I don't know how they were able to translate it, but the natives were aware of this line as well. Not all the
Yeah.
groups, obviously, but the ones that were, trading with the British and in communication were aware of what that delineation line was and
Yeah.
and where they could really be ruthless to anyone that was in their territory.
Yeah, that's one thing that I think people don't always realize is that indigenous people at this time had a really fucking good idea of what their boundaries were. Everybody knew where like their territory ended and someone else's began, you
Hmm.
know? I mean, like, and that's part of why, like, the Haudenosaunee in this conference are basically like standing by this, they're very big like in terms of like their side of the negotiations on saying like our territory goes all the way down into like what today would be like Tennessee, like encroaching in some ways on like it borders with the Cherokee, right? And they're
Right.
like,
Hmm.
we have conquered everything else going all the way down there because like seasonally they would often go like both of the Cherokee and the Haudenosaunee would like fight with each other sometimes and like you know go into battle, but like they knew where their boundaries were, and like the Haudenosaunee claimed that as hunting grounds for like decades at that point. Because they're expanding during this period. Their boundaries are getting larger at the same time that Europeans are also trying to like enlarge in their claims. But this whole like, oh, like I hate the idea that like indigenous people didn't understand property. It's like, no, they absolutely
No.
did.
No, they just
They
didn't
yeah,
understand the legalese. They didn't understand the
yeah.
legalese. That's it.
It's one
Doesn't
of those
mean I
things that
don't
like grinds
understand
my
what's
gears
mine and
because
what's
I'm like,
yours.
no, like they all know exactly where their territories are,
Yeah.
and can tell you. And I mean, and they do it in very like distinct ways where it's like, okay, it might be like this river that's a boundary or something like that, but we do the same thing,
Right.
you know?
Right.
Like most colonial, like if you look at early colonial boundaries, like they're all jagged because they follow rivers.
Hmm.
It's not until you get into the western part of North America where you get these straight lines that are all artificial in the
Hmm.
1800s.
Actually, and what I'll be talking about tonight, so I'm going to be covering the Mason-Dixon line, the history of its of its founding and why it was even needed. It was one of the first linear lines that was brought over and put into place by England when they were deciding how to break up territory. I did not realize until I was doing this research just how hard it was to put that line in place. You know what I mean? Like outside of natural boundaries, it is really difficult to figure out where a line exists. And apparently it
Yeah,
causes a lot of fights. A lot of fights.
it goes back to like the latitude and longitude, and like it's easy to do one, but it's harder to do
The
the
other.
other.
Mm-hmm.
But okay, so three more facts real quick. I had two from the arts and one that was just like different, but more of a world history thing that I thought was interesting. So in December of 1767, the John Street Theater opened in Manhattan, which was the first permanent theater in New York City. A man named David Douglas opened it with a performance of The Beaux Stratagem. I don't know anything about that play, but for people who are into Broadway, like you can trace Broadway's roots back to 1767 in New York City. Um, my next fact was that the Norway's oldest newspaper that is still in print, which is called and I will probably butcher this, so if you have anyone who's Norwegian who listens, then they can correct me. But it's the Adresseavisen. It was founded in 1767. So the oldest newspaper that Norwegians still read dates back to that period, which that's pretty wild to me. I think that it's a long, long way back.
It's really inspiring, the longevity.
Yeah. Okay, so my last fact, the Dutch East India Company in September of 1767 banned the importation of Southeast Asian slaves into the Cape Territory, like what would today be like South Africa, because they were considered too dangerous. Um, I assume probably warriors, since, a lot of times that was the case with enslaved people. Like when y'all were talking about Stono
Yeah.
before, there's been a lot of scholarship on it, like the battle tactics that they used, and the fact that a lot of people were probably warriors who were sold into captivity, and then they were like, "Fuck this! Like, I know how to fight." Like, so the Dutch were like, "We're done. Like, nobody can take." Slaves from Southeast Asia. So that would be like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, like that sort of area, and import them into Africa
Which
because
they don't get enough due. Those are some really warrior places. Like when I think of
Mhm.
Cambodia, I think of straight up badasses, truthfully. Like
Yeah.
historically in my head, that's what I'm picturing.
Oh yeah. So like one bonus fact that I didn't include, and I just remember reading, so I was looking for like what to put on my list. Um, the I think it's like this army. I think from it's either Laos or Cambodia. I don't remember. Invades Siam, which is like part of
Hmm.
Thailand, right? Today, and at this year too, and like conquers one of the other states. So I mean, like we're talking like warriors and kingdoms, and like I don't know that much about Southeast Asian history at this time, but I think it's important to point out that like there's lots of stuff going on in the world at this
Yeah.
point. Like kingdoms are
Yeah.
rising and falling, and there's all sorts of politics going on
Yeah.
worldwide.
Well, and let me take a moment to do the let me ruin that for you. Because why do we think about them like this, right? So, like a lot of what the US did when it comes to propaganda was when they were bringing people over, enslaved people or indentured servants or stuff like that, they needed to create stereotypes about the people to make them either be in a place where, of course, they're subservient to us because that's in their nature, right? So when we think about how they brought a lot of the Asian countries over, especially when it comes to like the Chinese into California and the railroad system, all of that was about creating a really docile idea of what an Asian man and an Asian country came from, right? It was like they're subservient. They really don't know any better. They're like they're here to help us. They're smart, but they need direction, you know? And don't worry about fighting them. They're weak. They don't, you know what I mean? So like they're building this, the American propaganda machine is building this whole idea. The same way they did with Black people, the same way they did with Hispanic people, right? You have very specific set of things that come to mind when you think about a specific demographic. You know, America did that on purpose to help ease into these racial ideas that are the foundation for the country. And I think that that's a shame because in doing so, it erases so much of like what you're talking about, this Asian past of, I mean, straight up warriors and like fighters and like strategists that we as a society probably don't take serious enough, you know, because
Hmm.
we have this idea of the stereotype of their background and who they are as people. Okay, that's it. That's my let me ruin that for you.
You have to get it in somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, let me just wake you up just a little bit, please. Karina's like, so.
I
Oh,
didn't know if that was all your facts.
yeah, that was it. Y'all got a bonus one, so
Oh, yes, you're
it's
right.
nine, not eight.
Oh, that's crazy. How do you keep it in your brain?
I don't know.
All right, Randy. Are you ready to set the scene for next week?
For next week.
For
Oh,
your
yeah.
next one?
Yeah,
Hmm.
for my Mason-Dixon line. Well, the next one I do, it won't be until the 1800s. So we won't talk about the Mason-Dixon line again until the podcast hits like 1825, 1830, when
Oh,
it
it'll be a
starts,
while then.
yeah, when it starts re-entering the conversation. This is the Mason-Dixon line like I have never known it. I didn't have any reason to go any further into the history of the Mason-Dixon line because we know what that is, right? Like when I think about it, it is the line of freedom. It's the line where you're either a slave or you're a free man. That's what we get when we're talking about the Mason-Dixon, right? But this was actually a line that was named for two men who surveyed it, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon. And it took 4 years to survey. So, well before um, the Civil War, well before a lot of those tensions were rising, you know, even at the beginning of when we're starting to see huge booms in the enslaved population, Jeremiah Dixon and Charles Mason are out doing this survey. So the 4 years between 1763 and 1767, these men with a small little army that is there helping them clear a path to mark this line cover roughly 233. Some people say that they surveyed 244, but the line was 233 miles. But it was laying out this Mason-Dixon line. Okay. So this story, I told Karina already that it is going to be very interesting because I have the whole backstory written out in terms of a timeline, but I'm really going to be shooting off my hip once we actually get to the Mason-Dixon plotting part because I don't have a script for us tonight. We're really just going to be chatting, okay?
I like it.
So so let's go with it. So the Mason-Dixon line that I'm thinking of, right, the slavery one, that doesn't exist until 1850. What comes about in 1763 is this line that is needed to settle territory disputes, right? So for us, that may be as small as like yelling about your neighbor's fence being 3 feet over into your property line. for a few different states here in the United States, well, in the colonies at the time. It was a big fucking deal because it had to do with taxation, it had to do with farming, it had to do with who was in charge of what trading outposts. So, territory disputes were actually a lot more aggressive during colonial expansion, okay? So that's what we're going to be building up to today is the colonial expansion. That's what we're going to be talking about. And then we're going to be talking about how England actually ended up settling this fight that was going on. So this kind of all begins in 1632, where a man by the name of George Calvert was given a charter to the New World. I'm air quoting because you guys can't see me. But King Charles I gives George Calvert a charter. And this is to repay a debt. So George Calvert, the Lord of Baltimore, he's the first Lord of Baltimore. He has been like an advisor, an aide. He's been assisting the king and the crown. And he is really wanting to establish a colony. He tried before, he was up in the Newfoundland area. It was really cold. He was trying to build a utopia. It wasn't working. He got pushed down. He made it to Virginia with the people that he had left of the group. Virginia welcomed them, but he was like, this place isn't for us. Virginia was, and this is where I'm going to be having Greg pop in because Virginia was Puritan and George Culvert. Oh, no. Okay. Tell me, what were they?
So, so there were some Puritans there, but Virginia was more Anglican at that time, which is like Church of England.
Okay. But George
None of them
Culvert
liked
was,
Catholic though.
yes, George
Yeah,
Culvert was Catholic, and that's what I needed to clarify is that
yeah.
he made them uneasy because there was so much religious strife already happening in England around these denominations. They were like, we don't really want to get mixed up in all of that. And the Lord of Baltimore had already said he was not going to denounce the Pope. They were like, please just like reavow yourself to the Church of England, just say that you don't align with the papacy. He was like, "Yeah, I don't think I'm gonna do that, but thanks for asking." He
It's like
didn't
that meme that's like, no, I don't think I will.
I he wasn't rude about it. He was just like, "No, I'm not gonna do it." And then he leaves. And they go back and he starts petitioning the king because he wants a colony and they're like, "Okay, where can we put this? What can we do?" And so they're finding some land that's like below Virginia area, and it's going to be, the what we know as Delaware and Maryland, a little bit of New York and some of Pennsylvania. That's basically the land that got slotted out for the Lord of Baltimore. Except he never actually lives to find out about this. So George's son Cecil is the one who gets this final charter for Maryland. In He takes over. So his father died 2 months before the charter was finalized. And so he takes over. So there's some interesting things about the charter. I think it is the first time that England tried to contain a colony without natural boundaries. So kind of what Greg and I were talking about before, this is like the first time that they're introducing a linear line running east to west and they're like, okay, this is the line along the 40th parallel of latitude. The 40th parallel, this is your northernmost border, okay? And for reference, this is going to be important for our conversation later. If Maryland would have kept that 40th parallel, modern day Philadelphia would be in Maryland. So that's how much of Pennsylvania is in Maryland in today's maps. Back then, that wasn't the case. Maryland had all of that land. It had, like I said, Delaware. It was really um, a fertile and fruitful area for them to be. And so Cecil, the second Lord of Baltimore, gets this enormous amount of power. So they call it a palatinate state. I don't think I'm saying that right, Greg, but
I think that's right.
it's basically it makes the Lord of Baltimore the king of the whole colony. He's basically a king in his own right. He can enact legislation, he can create little fiefdoms and give it to people, he can barter and create treaties with the natives. He can like he if he were to go into a dispute with Virginia, it would be really kind of difficult because they're both English colonies at this point. So
Right.
they're like if he were to get into a fight with Virginia, they would be beholden to whatever the crown says,
Right.
but Lord of Baltimore could just kind of negotiate
But
as an
also,
independent state.
it's like a little more so like whenever I'm teaching, we talk about those as proprietary colonies. Like they're the
Hmm.
property of Lord Calvert, or like Pennsylvania is a
Hmm.
proprietary colony. 'Cause it's a similar story. Like the king owns William Penn's dad, like Admiral Lord Penn, a bunch of money, and basically it's like, all right, we're square. I'll give you this territory. But like Virginia's a joint stock company, so it's owned by shareholder. It's technically owned by the Virginia company, which is beholden to its shareholders and stuff, but like has the blessing of the king. You don't really get like that many royal colonies where the king's directly managing them until
Hmm.
later.
Yeah.
It's kind of the Wild West,
It is. And it's important to remember that in this story because that is what these men are acting like. Like, let's see what we can get away with. Let's push our boundary as far as we can absolutely go. And I'm going to read everything to my benefit until, Daddy King comes over and tells me that I can't do what I'm doing right now. That's how they're operating, the colonies are operating. So there's like a lot going on in this time period, right? So 1664, the Duke of York is given lots and lots of land in an effort to push out the Dutch from the Delmarva Peninsula. The in a brilliant stroke by the Dutch because they were really at this point they were interested in trading rather than occupying land and colonizing. They basically are like, okay, we'll give you the land, but we still are going to operate our trading posts along the river in 1664. And and the English are like, okay, that works for us. We're just going to make this transition. It's supposed to be a bloodless transition of power. It did not end up going that way. There's some unfortunate incidents that happened with some overzealot soldiers who just really are down for making it messy. But the Dutch were pretty much ready to give England what they wanted and just continue along with their trading. Now, in the late 1660s, a new map was commissioned of the area just to kind of get a better idea of what was going on. There was, again, the Dutch disputes. There was the Duke of York that had come and had taken some lands, and he had pushed down and ended up taking parts of Delaware out when he did all of that. And so a new map was commissioned by Maryland to figure out what exactly was going on. And as an aside, can I just say I did not know that Maryland was named after, well, there's two different accounts, but I was in the one that I'm choosing to believe. Maryland was named after Culvert's wife. I thought that was nice. It was a nice little romantic gesture to name a whole, state now after her. Anyway, by 1672, New York is preparing for war against Maryland, but war end up ends up breaking out against the Dutch, kind of distracting them just a little bit. In 1675, Bacon's Rebellion happens, and that really pushes their native allies. So Maryland is really not in a place to negotiate or barter or trust any of the tribes, or I don't like that word, any of the nations around that colony. And then in 1681, the worst thing that could possibly happen to Maryland happens. So, like Greg said, Pennsylvania happens. William Penn is a vice admiral, and in order to pay back this debt, which I think is kind of ironic because William Penn ends up going to debtor's prison, doesn't he? And he like suffers because of how poorly he managed his finances. But the king owes him and gives him this huge plot of land. And in order to kind of like settle the land dispute, trying to see into the future and knowing that people are fighting and the neighbors are pushing up against each other and they're expanding and the colonies are just growing. The people in England are like, okay, when we write the charter, we're going to say that the southernmost boundary of Pennsylvania is the 40th parallel of latitude, which is the northernmost border of Maryland in their charter. But they put in there that it is 12 miles north of Newcastle or the 40th parallel, whichever comes first. That's how, that's basically how they write it. Well, figuring out exactly the latitudes of these places, especially given how poorly maps were drawn a lot of times in these areas, it was difficult. So the city that they were talking about drawing a line around was not at the 40th parallel. It was actually 30 miles south of that parallel. And that created this big, huge issue because William Penn was like, okay, I'm going to read this to my advantage. So I'm going past the 40th parallel to that 12-mile line. Maryland's like, the hell you are. Get back up. Get back up. You're at the 40th parallel. And so it creates this like whole strip of land, and they also contest the some bits of Delaware. But it's a lot of the action is happening up here in this like strip of land that's the 40th parallel. So William Penn gets Pennsylvania. I thought that this price was ridiculous. They have to pay 2 beaver skins annually. That's what William owes the king for the colony of Pennsylvania.
How did they measure that? Who guessed who?
And
Why?
he had to mail them. He had to get
Oh,
2 beaver skins and mail them off.
Yeah, I think they have to just provide them, you know.
right, but who said this is the quantity, this is what you need? Who chose that number? Why? That's just what he needed.
It was just it's like a bro thing. It's like, okay,
Yeah. Well, so
give me $1 every year. Like I'll sell it to you for $1.
so beaver skins were like a hot commodity though, you know, at the time. Like
But
that's what
only two
two
would
is
make
very
me think
low in
of,
number.
yeah, two would make me think of personal use maybe,
Yeah.
or like a write-off. That sounds like a write-off.
Yeah, my tax write-off is 2 beaver skins.
Well, they used them to make like hats specifically.
Tax write-off was 2 beaver skins. I can't.
Maybe he needed like, yeah, maybe his favorite hats were beaver hats and he just had to
They
have
were
two
all the
fresh
rage at the
ones.
time. That's partly why the beaver skin trade was so big.
It's insane. Anywho, okay, Randy, go on.
Sorry. Okay, so I should also mention here that Penn was a Quaker. And so that's also an interesting. I'm mostly going to talk about just the disputes because I think a lot of this was, people being greedy. But there's a really interesting perspective about the way that they didn't trust each other and the way that they made each other nervous because of the religion aspect of it. There is something there to that. But again, I'm just going to talk about them being a little baby. Okay, so that's all happening in 1681. What happens later? So William Penn's not actually in America yet. He's like, I got to do something. I got to tell someone to become governor. He writes a letter to a man named William Markham, who becomes governor, and begins to send correspondence to settlers on the land that Penn has now, like, kind of decided that is his, specifically talking about like the Delaware area and parts of lower Pennsylvania, right? So William Markham is sending these letters to settlers, to homesteads, to people who knows Lord Baltimore, Cecil Baltimore of Maryland, and he's basically saying, "Hey, so I just want to introduce myself. My name's William Markham. I'm the new governor. You now live in Pennsylvania. I thought I'd be the first to welcome you. In case you didn't know, this is what happened with the grant, and we're going to be taking you over. If you have questions, we can't wait to meet you, but you know, can't wait to talk further." And he's sending them just before they've received notices from the crown, before anything has happened. Lord Baltimore is absolutely furious, and William Penn's like, "Yeah, this is a good idea. We should just be telling everyone preemptively that I own them."
That's a choice. That's a decision. I would honestly, if I was Lord Baltimore, I would be livid.
Yeah.
Cannot blame him.
Yeah.
And also the audacity.
hmm
Amazing.
And Pennsylvania
Phenomenal.
isn't really like Pennsylvania isn't like the powerhouse that it is going to become yet, right? So Philadelphia around this time was so small that it couldn't even like host anybody coming to do these preparations or like anyone coming to meet in any grand style. In 1682, Philly had 80 houses, and that's also the year that William Penn gets to Delaware. And it isn't until 1685 that they had grown to 350 houses in Philadelphia. So, like, they're growing rapidly. They're moving the Quakers, they're moving the German into the area, but they're not like, in my opinion, they weren't like fighting ready yet. So to send those letters out was very audacious, very audacious. And these border disputes ensue. It just gets bad. So the charter for Penn, like I said, ended 12 miles north of Newcastle. And Penn decides, okay, this is for sure mine, and he takes the land. And the fighting is getting bloody. That same year, King James issued a ruling for a compromise. But due to survey and land confusion, Maryland ended up losing more land to the Delaware area, what we currently call Delaware. So the king coming in and being like, settle down, wasn't paying attention a ton. And the survey methods at the time, specifically by Americans who were not really skilled in doing land surveys, cost cost Maryland like 15 miles of Delaware shore because the survey was wrong and it just got taken away, in addition to the land that William Penn was trying to claim for Pennsylvania.
That's so
In,
sad. They
it
were
is
just trying
sad.
to do it the right way.
It is sad. I do feel bad for them. By 1701, the first survey of the Newcastle Circle, okay, the circle around Newcastle, that 12-mile circle, is done. In 1710, Queen Anne is not interested in helping Maryland maintain its borders. Maryland is already going through some really weird things with its charter. They're having a hard time with leadership. They're losing the colony. They're gaining the colony back. So Maryland's a hot mess. Queen Anne's not going to get into it. And then in 1729, Delaware becomes an independent colony from Pennsylvania. Delaware basically is like, hey, we've been here, we're good. We think we're a little too far for you, so would you be fine if we just became an independent colony? We'll still be your colony, we'll just be self-governing. And William Penn was like, yeah, that sounds fine,
We'll
and
still
moved on.
be your colony, but
Well, as we
we'll be
know, they don't stay there,
self-governing.
but yeah, they're self-governing.
We can still be together. We just will do our own thing, not talk anymore, and live by ourselves.
Hmm. Basically.
Delaware.
Hmm. So remember, the first couple of surveys I talked about, Maryland was getting the surveys done. So in 1729, the governor of Pennsylvania actually gets more maps done and establishes the territory once again below that 40-degree parallel. The Maryland governor is done. He's like, okay, we're gonna just fight this with people, right? Because ownership's 9/10 of the law, isn't that what they say? So like he's like they can't say anything if if our people are the ones that are populating that area. So he's trying to push and encourage settlement up along the river. There's two different rivers. I'm not going to attempt to say the name. But there's two different rivers, and he's like trying to push people to settle along the rivers in the fertile areas so that they can maintain ownership of that area. Well, enter in this really interesting character, Cressup, who was in charge of ridding Maryland, so that northern strip area, of Pennsylvania na and native people. So any Pennsylvanians or natives who were in that northern strip, specifically where he was and having people, the governor was pushing people to settle, Cressup was busy keeping them out. So incredibly much so that he built a very specific type of house. I don't know what the house is called. Greg, do you know what the
I
house?
don't.
So Crescent builds this like box house, and it's got a square frame, but then raised off of it is a larger box. So it kind of looks like the house is on a small foundation, if that makes sense. And it's got windows all around. It's he builds a defensive house basically. And he builds it so that he and his men can shoot from this house at all angles for defensive purposes. And many times throughout this conflict, he does in fact bring militiamen and soldiers to his home and to this area to maintain this dispute. So this time in the 1700s, it's getting very, very bloody. So the Maryland citizens were starting to get really fed up because it being in this dispute, I can't even imagine how hard it was to be living in that territory, right? Because one day you'd have people from Pennsylvania coming in and saying, you're ours, and these are the rules you need to follow, and this is who you have to pay taxes to, like coming in and getting all of that done. And then a couple of weeks later, it would be Maryland coming in saying, you're ours, and this is the rules that you have to follow, and these are the taxes, and we're going to take the money too. So they're having a really hard time. And Cressup's like, nah, dog, I roll for Maryland. And so he's like, when Pennsylvania Pennsylvania comes and they're trying to talk and he says, Cressup says, harass these Maryland citizens, he gets really mad and sends a letter to the governor of Maryland telling him all of this like awful stuff that he says that the representatives of Pennsylvania did. The governor, Lord Baltimore, not really sure which one we're on at this point, but the governor of Maryland is like, okay, Pennsylvania, send these men to face justice here in Maryland since all of these acts happened here in Maryland and they're harassing our citizens. Pennsylvania was like, no, We're not going to be doing that because that's our land and they were there on our authority and you can't hurt them. So it was hotly contested and it became really, really bloody. So this was kind of the turning point where Cressup starts attacking. And there's skirmishes and there's like bloody fights all along the river. Cressup isn't the only one doing it, but he's definitely like bringing in more militiamen, bringing in more guns, trying to really push the Maryland cause in the area. So much so that it dominates a huge portion of the 1730s for that area. Like this Cressup's, they call it Cressup's War, I think was waged for a total of 8 years in that area, even after like calls for the blood to stop and border to be agreed upon have been kind of pushed by the king. So 1731, the border citizens kind of go back and forth. They decide, oh, does Maryland help us? Does Delaware help us, depending on where they're at? Does Pennsylvania help us? Like, who should we be citizens with? And in 1732, Maryland and Pennsylvania meet up. They eventually agree on a border, but once they leave those negotiations, it all falls apart. The Lord of Baltimore is saying, "Oh, it's all wrong. They lied to me," like basically yelling foul. And the heirs of William Penn are like, "No, that's what we agreed to." So it just all falls apart. In 1736, they kind of count that year, even though Cressup's War continues for a couple of more years, a couple of more skirmishes. 1736 is really the end of the major armed conflict for this, and Pennsylvania continues to populate that strip of land more and more and more. By 1738, King George II made a proclamation that there would be a border established 15 miles south of Philly, and another survey is done. By 1750, all of these disputes are still happening. Maryland's still mad, still saying it's wrong. Pennsylvania's still mad, saying it's mine. They kick it over to England, and England's like, no, the 1732 agreement that you guys made is binding. Like, just go back to that. Just do that. Stop with this fighting. Just stick to the border. Did they? No. They did not. And by 1760, the crown was fed up. And they were like, okay, we're gonna have a survey done, and it's going to finally tell you exactly what the line is. We're gonna pave the line, we're gonna mark the line, and here's where we finally get to Jeremiah, Jeremiah Dixon and Charles Mason in 1763. Okay. Who did they pick, guys? This is like my favorite part. I'm gonna so enjoy talking about them because who did they pick? They picked like the nerdiest guys they could, and I love it so fucking much. Okay, so like Mason was an astronomer. He was really into looking at the stars. He was writing like he was a scholar at the time, so he's like writing observations of the stars and things that he's seeing in the night sky. And Dixon is more practical, more of like an engineer. He is very mathematical, he's very precise. And personality wise, they're really different too. One's more outgoing, one's more of an introvert, one's a man about town, one's really focused on family life, right? So it's this really interesting juxtaposition, but they're bonded by their precision and their love of like the work that they're doing. So I think it's really interesting that the group that they put together for this, specifically because in my head, if we were to try to do something like that now, I don't think that we would be choosing an astronomer and you know what I mean? Like, I don't think that that would be the team that we're like, yeah, you go survey. the Mason-Dixon line.
It'd be like Kanye West and someone else. I'm like trying to think of a good analogy here.
I see, you know what it makes me think of? It's like if we asked Queen to go do it. You know what I mean? If we asked two of the members of Queen because they were all amazing, like the astrophysicist Brian, we
Oh
could
yeah.
have him go with the bass guitar guy who was an electrical engineer or whatever he was. They could the two members of Queen could be the equivalent of
They probably could
Mason and
figure it
Dixon.
out.
That's basically the team they assembled. And they're doing something really cool. So they're about to do a geodetical survey, which is using the stars as a reference. And they did this with like breaking technology, right? This was like hot off the press, a thing called a zenith sector. It was a very specific telescope that was able to help them see the stars really clearly, and it was how they were going to be plotting the Mason-Dixon line. They were using Ursa Minor as their star, and that is how they were going to be figuring the 40th parallel, which I thought was a really interesting factoid. Okay, so Mason and Dixon arrive in 1763, and like I said, they get this small army together. And because they're really nerdy, right? They're really about the work, they're mathematical, they're academic. They have someone specifically mandated to run operations. They have a manager of sorts that runs the camp, that makes sure the food's done and that everyone's packed up and that the equipment's taken care of. He runs the crew because one thing you've got to remember when we're doing this, when we're talking about this, is that they're not using land as a natural divider anymore, right? So when they're doing this survey, they have to clear the way for them to figure out what this line is. So they have a team of people who are cutting down trees in front and behind them, who are clearing out brush, whose job it is to cross rivers ahead of them and help them scale mountains to do this Mason-Dixon line. So it's like a whole crew of men that are slowly they're making their way. So Mason is the astronomer, like I said. So his job is at night making sure that they are aligned with Ursa Major. And once his alignment is done, Dixon lays the line out in the direction using so they're like I said, they had state-of-the-art equipment. It looked like a giant protractor of sorts that they were using to I don't know what it's called. I'm sure it has a name, but it was all about angles. There's a lot of geometry that they were really using all of the mathematical tools in their repertoire in their tool set to figure this out. And in case you're wondering how they did this, because I wasn't quite sure how they did this, there's something called a Gunter's chain. Okay. It is one of the things that was in their tool belt. It's 66 feet long and 80 chain lengths equals 1 mile. So the way that they would do this is they would put the line down, they would line it up so they knew which direction that they were going, and they would take one chain, hold it taut, put a stake down, chain again. So they had to do this 80 times to make 1 mile. 1 mile was every 1 mile was given a stone marker. I also find it hilarious that England was like, your rocks aren't good enough for us. We're gonna send the markers for the Mason-Dixon line to you. Because that's what they did. These rocks are from England. One side says M for Maryland, one side says P for Pennsylvania. And every 1 mile, they put one of these stones, and then every 5 miles, they put a bigger marker that has like more emblems to the crown, and it has more signifiers maybe of like how long the distance has been. But so like every 80 links they put one of these stones. So that also is all being hauled with them across this landscape.
That's
They're do
really a lot of effort to be like, this is your side,
hmm
and this is your side,
Yes.
and
All
you
because
stay
I
over
they
also
there. You
but I
stay
also
over
like
there.
appreciate the precision though, where they're like, we're gonna do this right, so y'all can shut up about this, you know?
Yeah, it really was daddy spanking. That's what whenever I think about this, I that's what I picture. A father being like, "Okay, you want me to make a decision? I'm making the decision. Nobody better say anything after this." That's what it feels like. Like the final straw has really been broken. And they're doing this line through the brush. They're, you know, honestly, I'm really shocked and I'm really proud of these men for being so precise and doing all of that without any sort of explorer background or any sort of, you know what I mean? Like anything that would have lent itself to this level of navigation. I think I just think it's really cool that they were able to do that so precisely. And they cared so much about it. So it was taking forever. So after the first year, they had only gotten like 80 miles or so. And they were getting letters saying, hurry up, like you need to be done by the winter. They were saying things like, basically, it was because time was money. And the longer that it took them to do the line, the longer that the dispute was happening, the longer that they were having to pay people to be out there and clearing and helping them. So they really wanted the process to go faster. And Mason and Dixon were like, yeah, no. We're gonna do this right since you asked us to do this. Not to mention the fact, I also think we need to bring up outside of all of the geographical hindrances, there's also the weather to think about. So because they were doing this based off the stars, rainy days, they weren't moving. They weren't going anywhere. There wasn't anything that they could do. When it was pouring for weeks, when it was snowing, when it was cloudy, there was nowhere for them to go. They were kind of just stuck until it would clear up and they would be able to see the stars again. So it was a labor, a time intensive labor, this thing that they were doing. But they kept pushing on. Um, and what I think is most interesting is they ended up, because of how the border is, they ended up having to push past the proclamation line that Greg had talked about earlier, which was truly, I think, the most terrifying part of their journey. And as I said earlier, because the native nations knew that they crossed over. Like there's one specific example of an encounter they had with someone from the Lenape tribe who basically said, "Watch your back because if you keep going, I I know what you look like now and I will be watching out for you." And he like he basically just threatened them. It's not surprising. The native nations were not, the indigenous people were not unfamiliar to this push, this westward expansion, this taking of their lands. They actually had a phrase they called surveyors practitioners of pen and ink witchcraft, which I thought was a really fun little quote.
Did you read
Because
anything about the walking purchase by chance?
so a lot of my stuff was just articles this week. I did get this book that I'll be reading before the next part of the Mason-Dixon line, but it's just Mason-Dixon, The Crucible of a Nation. Have you heard
Okay.
of this?
No, I haven't.
It
But
might
like
be in here.
I have some like added context to like that whole bit about like this Lenape person being like, I know what you look like and I'm looking for you. Like it makes so much sense to me because like so, you know, you were talking about Penn earlier with Pennsylvania. Like one of the things that Penn really kind of goes out of his way to promote is this whole idea of like I went over there and I actually bought the land from the native people,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like that's part of like Pennsylvania's origin story, and Penn plays this up. Like he does make some trips there, and he visits the Lenni Lenape and negotiates a treaty, and whether or not they understand is like a thing, but like that was part of like what one of the things that Penn like held his colony up to be like. I'm better than all of you guys. Is that he's like, well, I actually bought the land regardless. And when he died, his sons were less focused on preserving that legacy, and they arranged for, I think it's in the 1730s, what's known as the walking purchase. It's either the 20s or 30s, I'm pretty sure. But basically, they hammered out like it was a boundary dispute, and they're like, we're gonna figure this out, and so we will go like the distance that a man can walk in like so many days will be like where our boundary line is. And what they did to like stack the deck in their favor is they like cleared a path for the people who are going to be the walkers, and they hired people who were known for like their ability to run, like essentially marathon runners, like people who could run really far. And they covered way more ground than expected. And then it's like that's how far we went. That's where the boundary is. And like absolutely fucked over the Lenni Lenape and other indigenous groups there. And it really is like the big starting point towards like declining relations in Pennsylvania between indigenous people and colonists. Like they had been all right before because Penn was really big on like oh, I want to be peaceful towards indigenous people. Um, but that's like kind of the big opening like bomb that sort of destroys all of that. So the fact that this Lenape person was like I like the fact that they call them like witches and they're like I'm looking out for you like makes
Mm-hmm.
so much sense in the 1760s.
And they did. They had more run-ins. Like as they continued on, they had more and more run-ins specifically on the other side of the mountains, on the other side of that proclamation. And it caused a huge group of their people to leave. They left. They were like, we're going back. We're not here for this. It's been too long. Um, which was actually very devastating because numbers were part of the reason why they were doing okay against anyone that they ran into in these woods because they had the number of people to beat any like raiding parties or anything like that. So it got to a point where where they were doing this survey and all of the men on duty would have loaded weapons on them. They were just ready to go at a moment's notice because there were so few of them left. So it took a long time. Like I said, it took 4 years, but by the end of it, there was 233 total miles of those stones, and the Mason-Dixon line was plotted. Afterward, Mason went on. I'm hoping I'm getting this right because I don't have this written down like I said. So Mason, I believe, because he was the astronomer. I'm looking at my notes. Yes. So he goes back to England, and that's where he lives out the rest of his life. He like does some other stuff. He does some surveying, but he uses his experience and just becomes like, an interesting person who's doing this work and a lot of good things in England. On the other side of things, Dixon stays in the United States, well, in America for a little while, and he is also doing surveys, continuing that work, and they become really, really famous and celebrated for the completion of this line. And basically, it's like a big relief point also for England because they're like, finally, we have something. You guys have been fighting for over 80 years about this damn bit of land. Now let's just put it to rest. It did not get put to rest. There was, in fact, a part of the survey that was not done appropriately in Delaware. It was between Delaware and Pennsylvania. That dispute com would not be cleared up until I think the 20th century in the 1900s. I don't have the exact date written down, but that would land would be contested. It's called the Delaware Wedge. It would be contested for over 150 years. And it actually got, oh yes, this is why. It actually finally was fully resolved and considered completed in the 19th century because there was a highway that was built under JFK, I-95, I believe it is what it is, in this small little corridor of that area. And he went to the ceremony and dedicated that bit of highway to the dispute and to everything that had happened in the history between Delaware and Pennsylvania. And then it was 20 days later that he was assassinated. It's actually one of his last public appearances before his assassination.
It's kind of wild how all these things touch each other a little bit.
I know.
Yeah.
Insane.
So that's basically it. So the Mason-Dixon line, specifically as I knew it my entire life growing up, again about slavery and all this stuff, did not hold any of that context at the beginning. And I say at the beginning because it would be a mere, 15 years. 1780 is the first time that it was used as a demarcation for slavery, which I thought
Okay,
was
it's like
really,
north south, like kind
yeah.
of.
Yeah, so it did not take them long to start considering that line to be more of a symbol in a lot of ways for the colonies. And slavery was booming at this time, right? So, like, by the time that the Mason-Dixon was completed, there were thousands of slaves in that area. There's
In
thousands
the
of
north
enslaved
too.
people.
I
Yeah.
think that's something that often gets downplayed, but like it's throughout the colonies. It's not just a southern thing.
Yes, it's on both sides of the Mason-Dixon. It's everywhere at that point. But this is the founding. So I just thought it would be interesting for us to talk about it today. It was something that I had never learned about, and I think it gives some interesting historical context. Before we talk about it again when we get to the 1800s. I do think it's interesting though that the Mason-Dixon line has always been in the middle of controversy. Like it was born of controversy, it continues to breed controversy. I don't know. I don't know what that's about, but I think it is interesting.
Yeah. I actually have like a personal connection to that because when I was in grad school in West Virginia, like when my son was born, the only way I could get him to like go to sleep in the middle of the day to like take a nap was to drive the car around till he fell asleep. So we drove around a lot, like outside of Morgantown, and one of the ways I would often go just because I would take like random back roads and country roads and like I ended up in some weird, like, isolated parts of West Virginia, like around Morgantown, but I would sometimes go up on this weird country road that went up to Pennsylvania and it would cross the border and there was always like this Mason-Dixon line sign. And I was always like, oh, okay, like I know this is like north-south border, but whatever. And then like when I crossed the border into Pennsylvania, there was this really creepy cemetery that I would drive by that like when it was foggy, it looked really cool because it was really old with like gravestones that are fallen over and stuff like that. But I always like have that whole like Mason-Dixon line burned into my brain from driving that way when I was like trying to get my kid to go to sleep.
And those markers, a vast majority of them are still like out there. Like if you go roaming around in that area, you can still stumble upon them. They're, decaying and covered in moss, but they're there.
I didn't realize there was like an actual line. That's the part that I'm like, wow, that is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
We couldn't handle disputes, so we had to make an actual line for
Yes.
generations.
And England
Drop
sent the rocks.
stones every mile.
Yeah,
Like,
they were like, just in case you fuck with the rocks in some way, we're gonna send the rocks, we're gonna send the people,
These are the
we're gonna
official rocks.
Like, there will be no favoritism commentary here. We're bringing it all to you.
That's wild.
I know, Karina. You were so quiet. How did you like it? You were.
There was a lot happening, I feel like. That
Mm.
was the one of the things is that I've been really focused on Georgia, Carolinas, people of color, which yes, they are all over, but also we haven't really looked at this region, and I did not realize how much drama Delaware came with.
Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, this is my first story about white people.
Yeah, it is. It is.
I really debated it. Maybe that's why I was so moody about it tonight. Getting ready to do it is because it's only the first half. I don't get to talk about the second half.
But it was very new information. It was a lot of stuff I was like,
I've already
who are
told
these
it.
people?
Yeah, I've already told it to a couple of people in my family, and they were like, I had no idea. They had no idea. No, Greg, you might be the only one that did know because of your PhD.
Yeah, like a little. I mean, like I know a little bit about Pennsylvania history and Maryland history, but the whole conflict about the border is one of those things that, like, unless you're looking at that region, you don't really spend a lot of time on, you know?
hmm
I can honestly say this is my first even glancing at this region.
and it was very much their own fight. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, New
they were
York did not care about Delaware and
Maryland
Pennsylvania.
Maryland was legitimately pissed off because they were like, yeah, we're fine when we're fighting the Dutch because this is what we expect. We expect to fight other Europeans. We do not expect to fight our fellow Englishmen. They're like,
Yeah,
what the fuck is this? We're
I didn't
being
think
screwed
Pennsylvania
over
was
by
going to do this.
York. We're being screwed over by Pennsylvania. We're being screwed over by the Kings.
Yeah, I'd be extra mad
It
if I
it
was a.
does make me feel bad for Maryland in terms of like they could have been like substantial, a much bigger state. They could have been a substantial contributor.
Okay, but they should have looked at their stuff first
Yeah, I don't
before
know.
Penn.
I don't know. There's a part of me that's like, I don't know, with like Maryland's story and Pennsylvania's story, I like the idea of there being places that were havens for outcasts, you know? And
hmm
like in England at this time, like Quakers and Catholics are kind of outcasts,
Yeah.
they're not
hmm
in the mainstream. Like Quakers more so. Um, so I don't know. Like that's one of those parts where I'm like, there's a lot I don't like about colonial history and, the way that Europeans just insert themselves into a place and they're like, we have a right to be here. But like looking at like European history, like internally, I'm also like, I feel like it's nice that there's a place for people who like other people in your home country would want to persecute, have a place where they can live and just do
Yeah.
their own thing, you
Yeah.
know?
I don't
And like
disagree with
Quakers
you.
today are like they're pretty fucking cool as far as like denominations go.
But how does a Quaker end up in a land dispute like this? Like that seems like the opposite of Quaker values. This I don't think that this is a great representation
So
of the Quaker faith.
that's true. So they're also very much like middle class merchants. Like um the there's a guy, I think we talked about Gary Nash before, actually, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
His dissertation was actually on the Quakers in Pennsylvania. So that was like the thing he did his research on to get his PhD. And he turned it into a book called Meeting House and Counting House, which I have. Um, and it's very much about like this sort of struggle that the Quakers have to be like spiritual on the one hand, but very involved in the world, when it comes to finance and money and trade and stuff like that. So, like, from that standpoint, land is money and those boundary disputes matter. And I can totally see them, like, going to the mat to try to get as much land as possible.
Well, so I was able to read like the first chapter and a half in this book. I really was sad that it was it was late arriving to me because you guys know how much I love to read a whole book before we we have our conversations. But one of the things that it did say was that William Penn had this whole strategy of argument that was simply just using Maryland's logic against them, right? It was not the logic that William Penn used for his governance of Pennsylvania or the way that he did anything, but in order to claim that land, he was like, "Oh, well, let's just whatever you said, reverse it, and that's why I get this land." Which I thought was interesting. It was kind of like I wasn't sure, it felt like kind of Robin Hoody the way that they were describing it.
He sounds like a man who thought a lot of steps ahead.
And yet still ended up in debtor's prison.
Yeah, amazing.
Actually, I don't know that that was his fault. Well, he did put together a really poor assembly that wouldn't pass the charter and lost his investors, and it was a huge contribution to why he didn't didn't have financial success in his colony.
That's a
There's
sad.
also like a whole debate about like, or I don't know. I've seen some people frame it where it's like, he's this like rich lord, like son of a lord kind of person, and kind of like inserts himself into Quakerism, right? Like, he's a rich guy who comes in and is able to be like, hey, I'll help you guys out because I have connections and money and I will make sure you don't get killed, you know. So he's a little. I've seen some people frame him as kind of like vulture-y, where he's like, I mean, he's gung ho, but he's like, I have this opportunity to swoop in and be like a mover and shaker in this religious group, you know?
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know who, like, I do feel bad for Maryland in this story, but I don't know who I'm rooting for. I don't know who I'm rooting for. Because I did prefer the way that the Pennsylvania, like you said, Greg, like it wasn't perfect and they were still sketchy, especially after William died, but Pennsylvania was they at least put on more of a show to be like, we have the moral high ground here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he referred to it himself as the holy experiment, that it was basically like we're going to treat indigenous people and like found a colony the right way, right? Like
Yeah.
we're going to treat them well, we're going to buy the land from them, we're going to do it better than anyone else. And then that all kind of collapses and turns into a dumpster fire.
But for the time frame, they did have fewer conflicts than their neighbors. I mean,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah,
for the
yeah,
time frame.
absolutely.
Karina, you're just shaking your head. Why?
I'm like we all have good intentions sometimes. Maybe. I don't.
What is it that they say? Not all rich people are bad, but all bad people are rich. Do we all have good intentions sometimes?
I believe it.
Sometimes.
Colin, I don't know. Capitalist intentions is what it feels like I'm talking about tonight, but
Yeah, but some of us are good at like masking it and being like, "See, I'm good for the people. I'm doing it for them. It's not even about me. I'm trying to help them out. I bought the land from them anyway."
and sometimes it works. Like I watch Narcos and for the first like part of the season, I'm like, yeah, like love your community and do all this stuff and like power to the people, and then it gets bad and I'm like, no, no. Actually, this turned.
How did we
I
get
think
here?
I think even when, yeah, because even when I think when bad people do things, even on the surface level, that it looks like it's for the people, if they get stopped at the right point, it really is just beneficial, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, but often it's like, oh, we moved a lot past that one
Yeah.
point.
Yeah, it's not often stopped. But Greg gets it. You get it, Greg. It could work.
Well, Randy, after the Mason-Dixon line, do you know what you are going to talk about next in our next few episodes?
Well, I don't have anything for sexy history yet, but I do know that coming up really soon, I will be covering the Trail of Tears. That's going to be, and I already have my books for those, so it'll be a refresher for me and a dramatic episode for y'all.
I was to say it's not going to be fun. Like you were like
No.
it's going to be, and I was like you can't say fun.
It's not gonna be fun.
No.
I felt like today was one of my more fun episodes.
Yeah.
That one will not be. I will have a hard time probably not crying in that episode.
Yeah.
So stay tuned, everyone.
Yeah,
Oh,
I'll give you a little random factoid tidbit. John Ross, who is one of the chiefs of the Cherokee during, the Trail of Tears and everything, buried his wife somewhere on the banks of the Arkansas River around Little Rock. We don't know where exactly, but she died during the he was part of the group that was traveling by boat, by barge on the water, and she's buried somewhere here. Where exactly we don't know, but that's a connection to Arkansas with that.
there's lots of connections actually. I don't know if you've ever gone hiking. I don't know why what's coming to mind is Ham Hill, but it's the one that sounds like the piece of meat, the meat company.
Hmm.
It starts with a P.
In Arkansas?
Yeah, it's like an hour away. Oh, it's gonna come to me at some point, and then I'll send it to you guys.
Yeah,
But
yeah. I don't know where it
I
is.
I went out
Like
hiking out
Pinnacle?
there. Pinnacle. There we go.
Oh.
Pinnacle meats. Pinnacle ham, Pinnacle.
Oh, but
Oh,
like Pinnacle
yes.
Mountain, like in Little
Yes.
Rock?
Yes, but I associate it with the meat.
Okay.
Pinnacle Mountain.
How's
Yes.
that where like what's the connection there?
So I went up there. I didn't think there was one. They had all of these markers showing like they would have overlooks, and it would be like the area that you're looking on is actually part of the Trail of Tears. This is where
Mm,
the boats would cross. Like there was this whole thing about there's actually a rock formation over there that they used as a navigation point, and it kind of describes I don't see anything when I look at it. It's just a rock, but it describes like the outline of it and what they were expecting to see and like the symbolism of the cliff face, which I thought
oh,
was really
cool.
cool. And I had no idea that Pinnacle was so involved in that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I could see that though, because it's like it stands out in the
hmm
geography, you
Hmm.
know,
When I
like
think about yeah, when I think about the Trail of Tears, I really think about the biking of it because that's like something that annually happens for the nation. So like
mm,
I'll get emails about like the biking in of remembrance will start. And so I don't think about it ever going along the waterways. That's like out of
yeah,
my head the majority of the time.
yeah. It's not like the main like pathway, right?
Yeah.
Like overland is
Yeah.
bigger, but like the waterways are important. Like even in Russellville where I teach, there's a part because like, the river becomes Lake Dardanelle and keeps going, and there's this causeway you can cross, and they call it Cherokee Crossing, but
hmm
the marker for that when you're driving on the road out towards like the power plant in Russellville is actually in Cherokee. It has the wording, which I think is cool. I always like when I'm teaching like in that era with my students, I'm always like, if you want to see like what like the Cherokee like grammar and vocabulary and symbols and writing looks like, you can literally go right down the street from, the university. It's like a couple mile drive. And you can see that like, we have markers of like Cherokee places like even here in Arkansas,
hmm
where they don't spend a ton of time.
Well, and I think it's one of the reasons why it's one of the most well-known tribes is because it crossed so much ground. Like it's one
Yeah.
of the only horrific things that was done to natives that's taught regularly in
Mm.
schools across the country.
Yeah.
Which
And
is an
weirdly,
interesting
everyone
thing to think
tries to
about.
bolt onto that too, I mean, like with the whole like
Yes,
everyone has
I
a great
suffer.
grandma who is a Cherokee princess or something like that, which like I have disabused a number of students of that where I'm like, okay, like
Mhm.
I've had multiple students come tell me like, "Oh, I'm part Cherokee." And I'm like, I'm sure you are. Well, like let's talk about the fact that this exists in like white settler culture, because my
Hmm.
ex-wife, like that was a story told in her family for a long time. And like I dug into the genealogy on Ancestry and I was like, y'all are Scots Irish all the way back to Virginia,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. And that's hard because I actually did have a great grandmother on the Trail of Tears, right? Like, and the
Yeah.
stories that we got were not like a Cherokee princess. It was I got stories about the horrific things that were done to her on the trip. Like those were the stories that I grew up with, which
Yeah.
I really feel like if you were Cherokee, it wouldn't be
Mhm.
like, oh, like this big thing. It's a story of trauma. That's what it is.
Oh yeah.
It is a story of trauma, and it is generational trauma that is given from one grandma to a grandchild. You know what I mean? So
Mhm.
I do think that that is also an interesting perspective because for me, a lot of that if you're excited to tell me stuff like that, that's how I know that that's not real ancestry.
Yeah.
If you're like, oh, this is it. And it doesn't come with any of the context of like it was horrific and it's a really hard story and I don't know that I want to talk about it. Okay, well then you're not talking about the same event that I am.
Yeah. Have you read anything by Vine Deloria Jr.? He passed a few years ago, but he was a chair. I don't know. I'd have to double check. He's indigenous. I don't remember his tribe.
Affiliation. Yeah.
Um I'm blanking. But he was a really big activist during the Red Power movement in the 1970s, and he wrote this book called Custer Died for Your Sins.
Mm,
That's fantastic.
I haven't
Like
read it, but I have heard about this book.
it's so good. He has a whole like section in there. I don't know if it's a whole chapter or not, where he like just breaks down the whole like Cherokee princess myth and stuff like that, and just how prevalent it is in white culture, which I think
Yeah.
is really
Yeah.
interesting, you know?
I don't even tell people I'm Cherokee because the first thing that they do is they're like, "Oh, you're not Cherokee." I'm like, "Okay, just because every Tom, Dick, and Harry out there is saying that they are doesn't mean that I'm not." And then I
Yeah.
feel like I have to get into this whole fight. Like I have a roll card, and then that makes me more mad because we're talking about that makes me think about blood
The Dawes
percentages
roll and
and the
everything.
government and
Yeah.
like being on the rolls was a really bad thing. So if you're not on the
Oh,
rolls,
yeah. There's a
like
whole like, do you even get on it or not, you know?
yeah. Anyway, so Karina, that's your teaser. This is all things that we will be talking about when we get to
I
the
can't wait to talk
trails.
about that. Like it's
It's
so
good. It's gonna be an intense uh I think it's gonna be an intense little one, but
I
yes.
always every time I teach the early Republic period, like post-Revolution, I always use a book on Cherokee history and the Trail of Tears, just because I think it's like it's such a good example of the struggles that indigenous people faced, you know, and like the
Mhm.
Cherokee faced in trying to do literally like, okay, you want us to do this because that's civilized? Right, got it, done. What's next? And like keep doing it, and then ultimately like it
It
doesn't.
wasn't enough. It
It's never
didn't
going to be
matter,
enough, right?
right?
Like
Isn't that how we started this episode? It just doesn't work that way. You can do what they tell you to do. They still don't trust that you did it and that you wanted to do it. And so they got to get rid of you.
yeah,
Full circle moment, Greg.
there you go.
I mean, that's how they get around traumatizing and abusing and colonizing whatever they feel like it.
I feel like we depressed you, Karina. You look
It's it's a
worn.
lot. Well, and anyway, that's 1767. Um, thank you so much for joining us on another episode of the Sip and Saga Society. If you enjoyed today's episode and would like to support our historical endeavors, please tell your friends. Follow us on the socials at sipandsaga_society or even visit our website, sipandsaga.online. But most importantly, Thank you so much for listening to us and coming back, especially those 9 people who continuously listen to our episodes every
The
single
first
time
week,
they
the
drop.
first week, whoever your nine
Thank
people
you.
are, we love you.
We love you. We appreciate you. Tell everyone you know, but most importantly, keep listening. But for now, we gotta go. So, goodbye.
Asta.
Bye.